August 1946. I still can't believe it. 5 shillings for each of them. Every week. Daisy Parker rolled out the pastry for the day's bread. Can you believe it? I think it is something I would have benefited from, with Johnny. And amused. A grateful nation is looking after its children. And 1/3 of a pint of milk, daily. They can get it at school, even with the harvest. Daisy went on. She handled the family allowance books on the table, then slipped them into her pocket. Anna watched her, smiling wanly. All the things she could have used when her husband had died, she had worked on. And Johnny had been left to his own devices. His own devices being cruelty and the almost manslaughter of Ernest Barrow, by leaving him to die out in the rain a year ago. It was a blessing Master George had been so understanding. Still, Johnny had been a changed young man since that awful day. Ernest had saved him, and had been so reticent in accepting praise. It was hard to bear. How glad she had been to see him leave for university in April. That reminds me, when you go down to the post office, there is a letter that needs posting. Anna told her. It had an address for Liverpool. Miss Sibby had asked her. It was fair enough, but who did she know in Liverpool? All this, and there's bread rationing now, Daisy continued. Flour and butter too. The farmers can't make enough. There may be labor shortages, but there's never going to be a shortage of farm work. Johnny's set for life, she added, warmly. Like Mr. Mason. Like Andy. The Downton housekeeper nodded, and then left. Daisy didn't mean it. She was trying to be kind. But her children, Flora and Larry, they were always at the top of the class. Like Daisy, they excelled. Farm work, or service work were not going to be their lot. Does his lordship know you have the radio down here? Anna asked Andy, as she glanced into the boot room. The strains of Dick Barton's Special Agent were coming out through the door as Andy fiddled at the back with a screwdriver. Oh yes, Andy nodded, confidently. I'm just trying to replace the valve. One keeps overheating and switching the set off. I'm trying to work out which one. His head popped up from behind the wireless set, a misnomer if ever Anna had heard of one, for there were far too many wires spilling out of the casing at the back. Mr. Barrow says if he's not down by 9, can you organize luncheon? Oh, no need to worry, Anna added, a quick glance to Thomas, before passing him on the stairs and making her way up to the servants' quarters for inspection. Any luck? Thomas asked. Andy bobbed his head up from the back of the set again. Nearly, I think, he replied. You know, if Miss Ashby gets a bit better, she can help out with. He didn't think. He really didn't think. Milo, with her deft hands and quick work, was like a piece of Downton Abbey. To Andy, it felt like old times, knowing she was here. Milo and electrical equipment were like bread and butter, were like tea and a biscuit, were like two things that only worked when both were there. She had been back for so long, and yet, Andy had forgotten she had not even made it out of Thomas Barrow's bedroom on her own. Albert had told him in confidence one night that she cried out in pain at night, and had sometimes woken him up. She would, Thomas told Andy, kindly. Aye, she will one day. When he got back into the kitchen, Daisy was staring at her family allowance book again. She looked up quickly when she saw that someone had come in, and squirreled them away back into her pocket. You can get it, too, Daisy told Thomas, when she had arranged for time that afternoon to go to the post office. Give over. Thomas scoffed, but Daisy took the book back out of her pocket again. It is for adopted children, too, Daisy told him. It's written here, look, for children adopted, fostered and naturalized British citizens. You should have one, for Ernest, for shoes, clothes, and that. She smiled weakly as Thomas peered at the conditions written on the back of the book. Paid to mothers, Thomas pointed out, pointing to the writing underneath. She's his mother, ain't she? Daisy asked. Milo. And she's your wife. So, she should have it. You're right, Thomas nodded, more to stop Daisy going on than anything. It was true he had adopted Ernest. The paperwork was witnessed and he had the adoption certificate, and a copy that Ernest always carried. But, sometimes, when he was on his own and thinking about everything, Thomas could barely believe he was a father, and that he had a son. Milo turning up as she had done, nearly 2 months ago, had not made the complicated situation less so. "How is she?" Daisy asked. "It's good of Master George to pay for her treatment." "Listen," Thomas shot back, so sharply that Daisy dropped her pastry knife. "I pay for Milo. I always have, since we were married." "Thomas, Daisy managed, her mouth open in horror. "Soon, Milo can be treated by the health service, with the money stopped for national insurance," he added. "Goes for everyone in the country, that does." "It's a good thing," Daisy replied, thankful the conversation had moved on to something else. "How is she?" "Much the same," Thomas sighed. "Which, I think, is a good thing." She brightened up when Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Carson came to visit. Milo had called him, the bear, to his face, but no one except for Thomas seemed to have noticed. Carson had been very put out having seen her. Thomas was used to how she looked nowadays, but he supposed, to Downton's old butler and housekeeper, it must have been a shock. What Thomas did not see was Milo slip a letter into Mrs. Hughes's hand and compel her to post it for her, as she had done that afternoon. "Good morning, Father," Ernest said, causing Thomas to turn in the entrance of the kitchen. Ernest was smiling, and Thomas smiled back. "She was talking to me about kings and princesses and queens just now, but she's gone back to sleep," Ernest told Thomas. "I said I would go over to Davis, see if he needs any help," he added. "Yes," Thomas agreed, walking with Ernest through the passage and out into the kitchen yard. "But don't be too long. Your mother likes you near her, and, well." Thomas trailed off, and instead of adding the words, "She could go any day," he drew his cigarette out from behind his ear, struck a match against the kitchen window frame and lit it, inhaling deeply. "So, tell me about Manchester," Thomas asked Ernest, sitting down on the wall near the coal house. Ernest sat next to him, and nodded. And he told Thomas of the lessons from Hartery's wife, a school teacher who took him for English, history, geography in the evenings while Douglas Hartery taught him mathematics, physics and chemistry at the university. He told Thomas of finding out about the work of Rutherford, and the people who had been there when he had made the great discoveries of the atom, and how he had found his uncle, Ernest Ashby, his name on a research paper to do with spectral analysis, and another to do with beta radiation. It was too early in the morning for Thomas to absorb what his son was telling him. Even his former lover's name was an injury to his overwrought mind. But there was something even more alarming when Ernest asked him about a certain Henry Barrow. "Henry Barrow, are you sure?" Thomas asked him. "Quite sure," Ernest assured him. "He said he had heard a Barrow was at the university, and I explained that I was your son. When he pressed, I told him me Lucina was my mother. He seemed very surprised at that." "I bet he did," Thomas agreed, thinking of his brother's expression in learning of Ernest. "Did he say anything else?" "That he would come to visit us," Ernest told him. Now, that would be a turn-up for the books, Thomas thought to himself. His younger brother, different and perverse, turning out to have held down a position in service all his life, and acquiring a wife and child. "And you like Manchester, then?" Thomas pressed. "I do," Ernest replied. "I like meeting different people and finding out what they do, or what they have done." He paused, and glanced to Thomas. "It is a funny thing, you once told me that a Dr. Patrick Blackett works at the university." "I did," Thomas confirmed. "Well, I met him a few times. But, on the day I was returning home, he was taken away by the police." "When was this?" Thomas asked his son. "Just before I came back." "I felt quite nervous," Ernest admitted, watching the smoke from Thomas's cigarette move into the air. "You see in Germany that was a very bad thing to happen to someone. Sometimes, you would not see that person again." Thomas waited for Ernest, in case there was something else. Lo and behold, the boy sighed, adding, "I understand from Constable Pickering that this is in Germany, not in Great Britain." "You spoke to Stanley Pickering?" Thomas turned to look at Ernest. "When I went out, last week, to Hull." And then Thomas remembered, but it had slipped his working memory. A lot had gone on. Milo had been better, and then worse. Master George had been to see her, and they had talked for a long time. After, He had assured Thomas that Milo could stay at Downton for the remainder of her days. Of course, Thomas nodded, and then his mind drifted back to Blackett, and then flitting to Chadwick, whom he had not yet called. It could be anything. With Blackett he is working on a very secret machine in Manchester. A computational machine, Ernest told him, and it is not really a secret. Ernest, Thomas said, after a few moments of silence from the both of them. Your mother is dying. His son gave Thomas a sad smile. I know. She told me. She seems very clear on that. She is everything I ever hoped she would be, he added. I wished I had known her sooner. He saw Flora look across to him from out of the kitchen window. On seeing he was with Thomas, she quickly darted away. I love her, Thomas confided in Ernest. I always have done, in my own way, ever since she fell screaming into the fountain in the Formal Gardens and had to be fished out by Carson and Mrs. Hughes. 88,888,888 vents were what were needed, at top of the tower. The first nuclear reactor, to produce electricity in Britain. John Cockcroft, Nobel Prize winner and site manager at Calder Hall, looked out from the brilliant Cumberland coast. Calder Hall, once a hall, now land purchased by the Ministry of Defence, facing west, to Ireland, Ernest Walton's homeland. It was what he had promised Churchill, and while Churchill was no longer Prime Minister, it was for him, and where his idea of a bomb had taken them, from war to peace. Not that they were involved with the Americans any longer. The U.S. Atomic Energy Act ended cooperation between U.S. and U.K. on development of nuclear technology. It had been good while it lasted. Now, the Americans had carried out nuclear tests in the Bikini Atoll, hydrogen as well as plutonium, to good effect. Propaganda had been swiftly projected around the world. Had it been shown to those on trial at Nuremberg they had pursued uranium as a weapon, they might now not be sitting in front of an international court. The course of the war might have been so different. Of course, they all knew Ashby to be no traitor. Those of them Rutherford had called his boys. Ashby was as much a boy in that sense as any of them. It wasn't Chadwick who needed convincing, of course. He had visited Cockcroft a week before, showed him Ashby's letter. She had written it all down, all of it, everything she knew, from the beginning of her time in Germany to when Prue had taken her away when the Americans invaded. Nothing at all could be interpreted as treacherous. Some might even have said Ashby had been courageous, brave, heroic. She would not have said that about herself. How fortunate that she had met Turing. Although that man was now being followed by MI6 as a security risk, because of his ... preferences. And Heisenberg, he had almost had it. The deuterium shortage had forced him and von Weizsäcker to turn to graphite. But he had wildly underestimated the energy a quantity of uranium would yield. Consequently, he had taken this back to the German Defense Ministry, estimating years, not months, to produce either a bomb or a reactor. ... Ashby always had a mind that could remember anything when once told it, underestimated, or been misled, or colluded with Ashby. For she had had a second part to her mission. Linman had ordered her to work in Germany. Chadwick had bade her sabotage. No, she was no traitor. Not that anyone would be able to judge Ashby's letter. Chadwick had ensured he had read it all before casting it into the fire. One made on the beach just before Britain's first nuclear power station was being built. ... So cheap would the electricity be, no one would go to the bother of metering it. And between them, Chadwick and Cockcroft had performed one last act of collaboration. Lindman would be starved of all information regarding Ashby, although ... Dr. Cockcroft turned from the sea view and back to the hole into which the uranium cylinders would be placed. Encased in 6 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, it would be a moot point. Soon, no matter the man's impotent ravings. ... Call himself a professor of physics. The poor woman. He would have liked to have seen Milo Ashby one last time.